London, November 6, 1956. Prime Minister Anthony Eden picks up a secure line in the cabinet room, expecting a status report on the paratroopers dropping into Port Said. Instead, he hears the cold, flat tone of Washington. President Dwight D. Eisenhower isn't interested in the Suez Canal or colonial prestige. He has a thumb over the detonator of the British economy. Ike's message is a jagged piece of glass. Pull out of Egypt immediately, or the United States Treasury will dump its massive holdings of sterling, liquefying the British pound and crashing the UK's internal markets by lunch. History remembers this as a military retreat, but it was actually the first modern currency assassination. Britain, the empire that once owned the world's ledger, discovered they were no longer the bankers, they were the borrowers. When the IMF, at Washington's silent command, refused a life support loan to London that same week, the financial oxygen was sucked out of the room. The pound didn't just fall, it surrendered its status as the global king. It was an 11-day collapse that proved you don't need to fire a single shot to erase a superpower if you own their debt. Fast forward to the present, where the United States is currently wielding that exact same Eisenhower-era blade, but with a sharper edge. Through Executive Order 1424 and the weaponization of the SWIFT messaging system, the Treasury has frozen hundreds of billions in foreign sovereign assets. We told the world the dollar was a neutral utility, then we turned it into a kill switch. This is the sanctions trap. By forcing rivals to find workarounds, the U.S. has inadvertently triggered a global engineering project to build a dollar-proof shield. The forensic data from the Bank for International Settlements, BIS, reveals a chilling trend for 2026. While we've been distracted by political theater, a debt maturity wall is approaching. Over $9 trillion in U.S. government debt must be rolled over in the next 12 months at significantly higher interest rates than the original issues. This isn't a theoretical risk, it's a mathematical certainty. Just as the Roman denarius was hollowed out by silver debasement to pay for a bloated military, the Federal Reserve is now trapped between hyperinflation and a systemic banking collapse. We are currently living inside the confidence gap. Central banks across the global south are dumping treasuries for physical gold at a rate not seen since the 1960s. They aren't just diversifying, they are escaping. If a major holder, not even an enemy, perhaps just a panicked ally, refuses to show up at a treasury auction in 2026, the phone call Eisenhower made to London will be made to Washington. Only this time, there is no bigger bank to call for a bailout. Your bank account isn't just a number. It's a passenger on a ship that has just hit the same iceberg that sank the British Empire. The most dangerous weapon in finance isn't a spreadsheet. It's a habit. In the 1870s, the United States surpassed Great Britain as the world's largest economy. By every measurable metric, industrial output, agricultural yield, steel production, the torch had passed. Yet for nearly 50 years after that flip, the British pound remained the undisputed king of global trade. This lag is what economists call inertia. It is the institutional ghost of an empire that continues to haunt the markets long after the physical body has withered. British bankers in the 1920s looked at this half-century of dominance and made a fatal mistake. They mistook convenience for permanence. They believed the world used the pound because it wanted to, ignoring the reality that the world used it simply because it had to. London was the only place with the deep insurance markets, the telegraph cables, and the clearinghouses. It was a monopoly of infrastructure, not a reflection of strength. Today, Washington is leaning on that same brittle reed. We call it exorbitant privilege. It's the belief that the US dollar is gravity, unavoidable and eternal. But inertia isn't a shield. It's a countdown. In the wood-paneled halls of the 1920s Bank of England, the mantra was, Tina. There is no alternative. They believed no other nation possessed the institutional depth to replace them. That arrogance led them to maintain a gold-backed pound that their hollowed-out post-war economy couldn't actually afford. We are repeating the script beat for beat. Since 2023, the Federal Reserve has watched the dollar's share of global reserves slip to 58%, the lowest level in a generation. The alternative isn't a single currency, it's a bypass. The forensic evidence for 2026 is visible in the central bank gold surge. According to recent IMF COFR data and 2025 World Gold Council reports, central banks in the global south aren't just diversifying, they are building an exit ramp. China, India, and even US allies like Poland have accelerated gold acquisitions to record levels, moving away from the store of value that US treasuries once provided. We are witnessing the multipolar trap. As the US weaponizes the dollar through sanctions, it accelerates the very competition it claims doesn't exist. By 2026, the inertia that protected us is dissolving. The Bank for International Settlements, BIS, has tracked a massive spike in mBridge transactions, a digital platform that allows nations to trade directly in local currencies, bypassing the New York clearing system entirely. The British thought their telegraph cables would save them. We think the SWIFT system is our fortress. But when the habit of using the dollar breaks, it won't be a slow fade. It will be a sudden realization that the king is standing in the middle of the room, holding a scepter that no longer commands the crowd. The financial system is designed to keep you in the dark, but history provides the map to escape the trap. If this insight opened your eyes, hit the like button to help us break through the noise. Share this with someone who needs to see the patterns before the next collapse, and subscribe to master the mechanics of wealth that they don't want you to understand. Don't let your purchasing power disappear in silence. Drop a comment below, and let's discuss the truth the 1% ignores. In 1925, Winston Churchill committed what he later called the greatest mistake of his life. As Chancellor of the Exchequer, he ignored the warnings of John Maynard Keynes and dragged the British pound back to the gold standard at its pre-WWI exchange rate. It was a move fueled by prestige rather than productivity. Churchill wanted the pound to look like the global king again, pretending the inflation of the war years hadn't happened. By artificially overvaluing the currency, he made British exports, coal, steel, textiles, prohibitively expensive for the rest of the world. To defend this fake strength, the Bank of England had to keep interest rates sky high, effectively strangling the nation's industrial heart to save its ego. Today, the Federal Reserve is caught in the exact same prestige trap. We are currently battling a higher-for-longer interest rate environment designed to crush inflation and maintain the dollar's global standing. But the math has changed since the 1920s. We aren't just protecting a currency. We are servicing a $34 trillion-plus debt mountain that is growing by $7 billion every single day. The Congressional Budget Office, CBO, and recent Treasury data confirm a terrifying milestone. In 2025, for the first time in history, net interest payments on the U.S. debt surpassed $1 trillion, exceeding the entire national defense budget. The U.S. is now boxed into a corner where every move is a checkmate. If the Fed keeps rates high to fight inflation and preserve dollar prestige, the interest on our debt explodes, cannibalizing every other government service from infrastructure to Social Security. If they cut rates to ease the debt burden, they risk a second wave of inflation, especially with 2025's new tariff regimes pushing up the cost of imported goods. Like Churchill's coal miners who went on strike in 1926 because they couldn't compete with cheaper foreign fuel, modern American manufacturers are reporting a weak end to 2025, with falling orders and unsustainable production costs. We are choosing to prioritize the financialized economy, the bankers and bondholders, over the productive economy. The S&P Global Manufacturing data from early 2026 shows the widest disparity between production and new orders since the 2008 financial crisis. We are hollowing out our ability to make things while spending our remaining wealth just to pay the interest on the money we already spent. This is the definition of a fiscal vice. By 2026, the Fed may be forced into fiscal dominance, a state where monetary policy is no longer about the economy, but simply about keeping the government from going bankrupt. In the early 20th century, Britain was famously called the workshop of the world. If you lived in Singapore, Cairo, or Buenos Aires, your locomotive, your cutlery, and your sewing machine all came from the industrial heartlands of northern England. But as the 1920s progressed, a quiet rot set in. British elites began to view manufacturing as grimy and old world. They shifted their focus to the City of London, the financial services hub. They outsourced their future to their colonies, believing that being the world's banker was safer and more prestigious than being its blacksmith. They didn't realize that when you stop making things, you lose the leverage to tell the world what your money is worth. The United States has spent the last 40 years sprinting down this same path. We transitioned from an economy that forged steel to an economy that writes code and processes payments. We traded the Rust Belt for Silicon Valley, and in doing so, we created a strategic vacuum. Today, the U.S. service sector accounts for nearly 80% of our GDP. We are world-class at making apps and financial instruments, but a 2025 report from the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission highlights a terrifying reality. We have lost the structural ability to be self-sufficient. This isn't just about cheap plastic toys. It's about financial oxygen in its most literal form. As of early 2026, the U.S. remains dangerously dependent on China for the active pharmaceutical ingredients, APIs, used in roughly 25% of our essential medicines. From antibiotics to blood thinners, our medicine cabinets are stocked by our primary geopolitical rival. Furthermore, the 2025 USGS Critical Minerals List confirms we are 100% import-reliant for several minerals essential to our defense systems and energy grid. We have built a high-tech service economy that runs on a hardware supply chain we no longer control. History shows that a reserve currency is backed by the productive capacity of the nation that issues it. When the world realized Britain couldn't actually produce the goods to back up the pound, the currency became a hollow shell. By 2026, the U.S. is facing a reality check. We are attempting to lead a global economic war while our industrial base is essentially a customer of our opponent. You cannot win a marathon if your shoes are manufactured by the person you're racing. We have traded our tools for a ledger, only to find that in 2026 the people with the tools are starting to write their own ledgers. In the mid-20th century, the British Empire held its colonies in a financial headlock known as the Sterling Area. It was a captive market where nations like India, Egypt, and Australia were essentially forced to keep their national wealth in British pounds. London didn't just ask for loyalty, they enforced it with exchange controls. If a colony tried to diversify its reserves into gold or the rising US dollar, the Bank of England would threaten to freeze their assets or impose trade sanctions. For decades, the pound survived as a zombie currency, maintained not by the strength of the British economy, but by the fact that its users weren't allowed to leave the room. The United States replicated this model in 1974, but with a more sophisticated hook: oil. The Petro-Dollar was born from a handshake between the Nixon administration and the House of Saud. The deal was simple. The U.S. would provide military protection and high-tech weaponry. In exchange, Saudi Arabia would price every barrel of its crude exclusively in dollars and recycle those profits back into U.S. Treasury bonds. This created a permanent, global, captive audience. If you wanted to turn on the lights or drive a car anywhere on Earth, you had to buy dollars first. For 50 years, this was the bedrock of American hegemony, allowing us to print money to pay for our deficits because the world had no choice but to absorb it. But in 2024 and 2025, the Independence Day for global energy finally arrived. The original 1974 framework has effectively been fractured. At the start of 2026, the data confirms we are no longer in a mono-currency world. Saudi Arabia, now a bridge partner to the BRICS Plus bloc, has signaled its openness to trade in multiple currencies to support its Vision 2030 goals. The era of exclusive dollar pricing is over. We aren't just seeing rhetoric, we are seeing transactions. China is now settling massive oil contracts in yuan, and the UAE has successfully bypassed the dollar to settle gas deals with India and rupees. The financial shield the world is building isn't just a different currency, it's a different architecture. The 2025 rollout of mBridge, a digital payment platform backed by the BIS, allows central banks to trade directly with one another in seconds, without ever touching a New York clearing bank or the SWIFT system. The captive audience is leaving the theater, and they aren't coming back. When the world no longer needs dollars to buy energy, the U.S. loses its ability to export its inflation. By 2026, the petrodollar isn't dying. It has already been demoted to just another option on the menu. In the 1960s, a Belgian-American economist named Robert Triffin identified a paradox that acts like a viral infection within any global reserve currency. It's known as the Triffin dilemma, and it's the reason why being the world's banker is actually a suicide mission. To keep the global economy moving, the United States must pump trillions of dollars into the system, which means we must run massive, never-ending trade deficits. If we stopped, global trade would freeze. But by doing so, we flood the world with so much of our paper that eventually the world begins to doubt we can ever pay it back. It's a choice between a global heart attack or a slow, agonizing loss of blood. Great Britain hit this wall in the aftermath of World War II. Their debt-to-GDP ratio peaked at a staggering 250% in 1946. They weren't just broke. They were mathematically incapacitated. For decades, they survived through financial repression, forcing their own citizens and colonies to hold low-interest debt just to keep the lights on. They were running a race with a piano on their back, and by 1956, the legs finally gave out. Today, the United States is staring at a 125% debt-to-GDP ratio, a number that looks smaller than Britain's until you look at the speed of the climb. We have officially hit the mathematical wall. According to the Congressional Budget Office, CBO, and the latest Treasury data for 2026, the United States is now spending more on net interest payments than on its entire military. Think about that. Every aircraft carrier, every secret satellite, and every soldier in the field costs less than the mere interest we owe to the people who lent us money. In fiscal year 2025, we paid $970 billion just to service the debt. By the end of 2026, that figure is projected to clear $1 trillion. This isn't just a budget line. It's a black hole that is swallowing the future of the American economy. The trap is now fully set. In a normal economy, the Federal Reserve would raise interest rates to fight inflation. But in 2026, every 1% increase in rates adds hundreds of billions to the deficit. We are no longer in control of our own monetary policy. We are slaves to the debt service. Just as the British pound was hollowed out by the sheer weight of its past obligations, the US dollar is entering a phase of fiscal dominance. The market knows the math doesn't work. When the interest on your past exceeds the investment in your future, you aren't a superpower anymore. You're just a collection agent for your creditors. In 1947, as Londoners stood in bread lines and shivered through a coal shortage that paralyzed the nation, the British government was still spending staggering sums to maintain over 100,000 troops across Greece, Palestine, and Egypt. It was a surreal disconnect. While the domestic infrastructure was literally crumbling, sewers leaking into the Thames and railways rusting from neglect, the empire of bases remained a non-negotiable line item on the ledger. They were policing a world they could no longer afford to feed, fueled by a collective delusion that global military reach was the only thing keeping the pound relevant. They didn't realize that a currency backed by ruins at home eventually loses its value abroad. Fast forward to 2026, and the United States has perfected this imperial overreach. We currently maintain upwards of 750 military installations in at least 80 countries. This global security utility is the most expensive credit card in human history. In the fiscal 2026 defense budget, the Department of Defense is requesting nearly $925 billion, a figure that would be astronomical if it weren't for the fact that we are simultaneously facing an infrastructure investment gap that the American Society of Civil Engineers estimates in the trillions. We are protecting the shipping lanes of the South China Sea, while the bridges in the American Midwest are being downgraded to structurally deficient. The year 2026 has become the ultimate tipping point for the guns versus butter debate. For decades, the America First movement was a fringe sentiment. Now, it is a dominant fiscal pressure. As states like Illinois and Idaho are forced to slash 3 to 4% of their budgets to brace for federal aid cuts, and the cost of the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, SNAP, begins to overwhelm local coffers, the American taxpayer is asking a forensic question. Why are we subsidizing the defense of wealthy allies in Europe and Asia while our own transit systems and power grids are entering a state of permanent recalibration? This isn't just a political argument. It's a structural threat to the dollar. A reserve currency survives on the internal strength of the nation that issues it. If the world sees that the U.S. is prioritizing 750 bases over its own industrial and social cohesion, the security premium of the dollar begins to look like a security tax. History shows that when the cost of an empire exceeds the benefit of the currency, the empire doesn't just retreat, it goes bankrupt. By 2026, the United States is finding that policing the world on a credit card works only as long as the world is willing to keep raising your credit limit. That limit is currently being hit. Ernest Hemingway once wrote that bankruptcy happens two ways: gradually, then suddenly. In the world of global finance, the suddenly doesn't look like a stock market crash. It looks like a quiet afternoon in a windowless room at the Treasury Department, where the bids simply stop coming in. This is the failed auction, the ultimate nightmare for a debt-dependent superpower. By early 2026, the structural cracks in the Treasury market have moved from the theoretical to the forensic. Data from the DTCC and the Fixed Income Clearing Corporation, FICC, shows that failures to deliver on U.S. government securities have surged, signaling a liquidity dry-up that mirrors the early tremors of the 2008 Lehman collapse. For the United States, 2026 is the year the debt ceiling game of chicken finally breaks the tracks. In July 2025, Congress narrowly avoided a default by raising the limit to over $41 trillion. But the reprieve was a hollow victory. The Congressional Budget Office, CBO, and recent 2026 fiscal reports confirm that the X date, the day the Treasury runs out of cash, is no longer a distant political football. It is a recurring structural catastrophe. When the U.S. government has to roll over $9 trillion in maturing debt while simultaneously fighting for the right to borrow more, the market begins to price in the default premium. The Suez moment for America isn't a military defeat. It's the first time a primary dealer, the big Wall Street banks required to buy our debt, fails to find a secondary buyer. This happened to the British in 1956, when the U.S. refused to back a pound-stabilizing loan, forcing an empire to its knees in 11 days. In 2026, the role of the executioner is being played by the collective global market. As the BRICS Plus nations accelerate their M-Bridge digital settlements, they aren't just trading in local currencies. They are withdrawing their participation from the U.S. auction process. When the world stops showing up to fund the American deficit, the Federal Reserve is forced to become the buyer of last resort. This is the point of no return. When the Fed prints money to buy the debt that the rest of the world has rejected, it triggers a feedback loop of devaluation. The forensic evidence is clear. The dollar's purchasing power against a basket of commodities has entered a secular bear market. In 2026, we are witnessing the first sovereign debt strike against a superpower. It's a moment of cold, hard math where a foreign power, or simply a group of rational investors, says no to the U.S. demand for more credit. At that moment, the exorbitant privilege evaporates, and the American lifestyle, built on the cheap credit of others, begins its final, sudden descent. When a reserve currency fails, the first casualties aren't the billionaires or the politicians. It's the people who believe that a saving account is a safe place to put labor. In 1970s Britain, this reality manifested in what became known as the Winter of Discontent. It wasn't just about strikes or trash piling up in Leicester Square. It was the psychological horror of watching a lifetime of middle-class stability evaporate in real time. Inflation hit 24%, and the pound's purchasing power was sliced in half almost overnight. To the average Joe in London, this meant that the dream of a comfortable retirement didn't just move further away, it ceased to exist. By 2026, the American middle class is beginning to inhabit this same inflationary trap. For decades, the dollar's status as the global king acted as a giant subsidy for the American lifestyle. Because the world had to hold dollars, we could import everything, from iPhones to avocados, at artificially low prices while exporting our inflation to other countries. But as that captive audience leaves the theater, the subsidy disappears. Recent 2025 and early 2026 data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics reveals that food prices are consistently outstripping general inflation, with staples like meat and dairy hitting all-time highs as the dollar's global strength wavers. The forensic impact on your 401k is even more chilling. Most Americans have their retirement tied to a 60-40 portfolio of stocks and bonds. In a world where the dollar is just another currency, those bonds, specifically U.S. Treasuries, become toxic assets. As foreign central banks dump their holdings, bond prices crater and yields spike. This doesn't just make it harder for the government to borrow, it wipes out the safe portion of your retirement nest egg. Your 401k statement might show a larger number of dollars, but if the dollar has lost 30% of its value against a basket of global goods, you are effectively retiring into poverty. This is the hidden tax of a failing empire. When you walk into an Apple store in 2026, you're not just looking at a new phone, you're looking at a global price tag. If the dollar isn't the king, the cost of an imported smartphone isn't $1,000, it's $800. The middle-class dream was built on the foundation of a dominant currency that made the world's resources cheap for us. Without that foundation, the American lifestyle becomes a luxury that only the top 1% can afford. We are discovering, just as the British did, that you cannot eat prestige and you cannot fund a retirement on the memories of a superpower. The ghost of Anthony Eden doesn't haunt the halls of London anymore. It has migrated to the corridors of the U.S. Treasury. As we close the ledger in 2026, the parallels are no longer just academic. They are forensic. We have traced the identical patterns of a falling giant. A debt-to-GDP ratio climbing toward a point of no return. A global military footprint that our domestic infrastructure can no longer subsidize. And a deep-seated institutional arrogance that mistakes historical habit for mathematical law. Britain believed the pound was eternal because it always had been. Washington believes the dollar is too big to fail for the exact same reason. But in the world of high finance, too big to fail is usually just the final stage before too big to save. The forensic data from the start of 2026 confirms we are living in the echo of 1956. We've seen the interest on our $38 trillion national debt eclipse our entire military budget. A milestone of decline that has preceded the fall of every major reserve currency in history. We've watched the M-Bridge and BRICS Plus payment systems transition from pilot programs to operational bypasses, effectively cutting the financial oxygen that once allowed us to dictate global terms. The ultimatum Eisenhower gave to the British, withdraw or we liquidate you, is now being prepared by a multipolar world that has finally finished building its exit ramp. Our final mistake is the belief that we have more time. We act as if the inertia of the 20th century will protect us from the physics of the 21st. But the debt maturity wall of 2026 is here. Over $9 trillion in U.S. debt must be rolled over this year into an environment of higher rates and lower global demand. We are currently playing a game of chicken with the laws of arithmetic, and the arithmetic is winning. If 2026 becomes our 1956, it won't be because we were defeated by a foreign army. It will be because we refused to acknowledge the hole in our own pocket until the last coin fell through. The math doesn't care about our history books, our political speeches, or our sense of exceptionalism. It only cares about the balance sheet. We are standing at the same crossroads where the British Empire once stood, watching the sun set on a century of dominance. We can choose to face the forensic reality of our debt and restructure our future, or we can continue to sleepwalk into the suddenly moment. 2026 is the year the warning light on the dashboard stops blinking and stays red. The question isn't whether the world is changing. It's whether you are prepared for the day the dollar becomes just another currency. If you want to understand the hidden mechanisms of power before they catch you off guard, you need to stay ahead of the data.